When Lewis Hamilton's Mercedes breaks down during a rainstorm near Stevenage, he finds himself at Morris Motors, a small garage seemingly frozen in time. There, Walter Morris, a quiet elderly mechanic with remarkable skill, fixes his car with surprising ease. Lewis notices vintage racing photos on the wall, but thinks little of them. A week later, drawn back to the garage, Lewis begins to uncover Walter's hidden past as a Formula One driver from the 1960s who left the sport after a fatal accident at Hockenheim, an accident that claimed the life of Michael Hayes, a young driver who, as Lewis will discover, was his mother's cousin. Lewis Hamilton tapped his fingers on the steering wheel as rain hammered down on the roof of his silver Mercedes. The windshield wipers swished back and forth, fighting to clear his view of the winding country road ahead. He was just 10 miles from Stevenage, the town where he grew up, but the storm was getting worse by the minute. "Come on," Lewis muttered to himself. "Just need to make it home." He was tired. The British Grand Prix at Silverstone last weekend had been rough. His car had strange problems the whole race. The Mercedes team's best engineers couldn't figure out what was wrong. Lewis finished in 5th place, far from the podium he'd hoped for in front of his home crowd. All he wanted now was to reach his parents' house, have a hot meal, and forget about racing for one night. The car jerked suddenly. Lewis frowned and gripped the wheel tighter. Something wasn't right. The engine made a clanking noise, then sputtered. Warning lights flashed on the dashboard. No, no, no. Not now. Lewis steered toward the side of the road as the car began to slow. He pressed the gas pedal, but nothing happened. The Mercedes rolled to a stop, steam rising from under the hood despite the rain. Lewis hit the steering wheel with his palm. Perfect. Just perfect. He pulled out his phone. No signal. Of course. Rain streamed down the windows as Lewis looked around. There were no houses in sight, just green fields and hedgerows on both sides of the narrow road. In the distance, maybe half a mile away, he spotted a small building with a faded sign. It looked like it might be a garage. Lewis sighed, grabbed his jacket from the back seat, and stepped out into the downpour. The rain soaked through his clothes almost instantly. He locked the car and began walking, head down against the wind and water. The walk felt longer than it looked. By the time Lewis reached the building, he was drenched from head to toe. Up close, he could see it was indeed a garage, though it looked like something from his grandfather's time. A rusty sign hung above the door. Morris Motors. Lewis pushed open the door, which creaked loudly. The inside was warm and smelled of oil and old wood. Tools hung neatly on the walls. An old radio played quiet music from the 1960s. "Hello?" Lewis called out. "Anyone here?" A shuffling sound came from the back of the garage. A moment later, an elderly man appeared, wiping his hands on a rag. He had white hair, bushy eyebrows, and skin wrinkled by years in the sun. His blue work shirt was faded but clean, with the name Walter stitched on the pocket. "Well, you're a wet one, aren't you?" the old man said, his voice warm and gravelly. "Caught in this monster storm, I see." Lewis nodded, water dripping from his hair. "My car broke down about half a mile down the road. I was hoping you might be able to help." The old man looked Lewis up and down, not seeming to recognize him. Most people knew Lewis Hamilton instantly. The 7-time Formula One world champion wasn't exactly anonymous in England, but this old mechanic just saw a young man who needed help. "Walter Morris," the man said, extending a hand. "This is my place." "Lewis," he replied, shaking Walter's hand. His grip was surprisingly strong for someone his age. "Let me get you a towel, Lewis. Then we'll see about that car of yours." Walter disappeared into a back room and returned with a clean towel. As Louis dried his face and hair, Walter grabbed an old umbrella and a toolbox. "What sort of car are we looking at?" "It's a Mercedes AMG. Just started making strange noises and died on me." Walter nodded. "Cars these days, full of computers. Sometimes I think the old ones were better. Simpler to fix, at least." He smiled. "But I've been working on engines since before you were born. Let's have a look." They stepped back into the rain, sharing Walter's large black umbrella. As they walked, Walter asked Louis about himself, but nothing about racing or fame. It was refreshing. Louis answered simply, saying he worked with cars and was visiting family in Stevenage. When they reached the Mercedes, Walter let out a low whistle. "She's a beauty, isn't she? Shame to see her in trouble." Louis unlocked the car, and Walter popped the hood. Despite the rain, the old mechanic studied the engine carefully, his eyes moving methodically from part to part. His wrinkled hands moved with surprising grace over the components. "When did the trouble start?" Walter asked, not looking up. "Just a few minutes before I stopped. It made some clanking sounds, then lost power." Walter nodded, reaching deeper, into the engine. "Pass me that small wrench from the toolbox, would you?" Louis handed him the tool, watching with interest. Even with all his racing knowledge, Louis was impressed by how quickly Walter seemed to understand the problem. "Ah," Walter said after a few minutes. "Here's your trouble." He pointed to a spot Louis couldn't quite see. "There's a small crack in your cooling system. It's letting air into places it shouldn't be. That's what caused the overheating. And look, here," Walter pointed to another part. "This connection came loose, probably from driving on these bumpy country roads." Louis was surprised. These were simple problems, but exactly the kind that could cause a car to break down completely. Most modern mechanics would have hooked the car up to a computer first, but Walter had found the issues just by looking and feeling. "Can it be fixed?" Louis asked. Walter smiled. "Everything can be fixed, young man. Some things just take more time than others." He closed the hood. "Let's get her back to the garage. I've got an old tow truck that should do the job." They walked back to Morris Motors, this time talking about the storm and how the weather in England was always changing. Walter didn't walk very fast, but his steps were steady and sure. At the garage, Walter started up an ancient-looking tow truck. The engine roared to life, sounding strong despite the truck's age. "Had this old girl for 40 years, Walter said, patting the truck's dashboard. "Never let me down once." They drove back to the Mercedes. Walter hooked it up to the tow truck with practiced ease. Louis offered to help, but Walter waved him away. "You're already soaked through. No sense in both of us being drowned rats." The drive back to the garage was slow but smooth. Walter handled the tow truck like he'd been born in it. Louis noticed the old man's eyes, constantly checking mirrors, scanning the road ahead. The habits of someone who really knew how to drive. Back at Morris Motors, Walter backed the Mercedes into a spot and started working right away. Louis watched, fascinated. Unlike the high-tech Mercedes garage with its computers and specialized tools, Walter used simple wrenches and his own two hands. Yet he worked with incredible precision, almost like he could feel what the car needed. As Walter repaired the cooling system, Louis wandered around the garage. On one wall hung several old racing photos. They showed various tracks that looked familiar to Louis: Silverstone, Monaco, even the old Nürburgring. The cars in the pictures were from the 1960s, beautiful machines from racing's most dangerous era. Louis was studying the photos when Walter's voice broke his concentration. "All done," the old mechanic said. "Want to start her up?" Louis turned, surprised. "All ready," Walter nodded, wiping his hands. "It wasn't too serious. She should run fine now." Lewis got into the Mercedes and turned the key. The engine started. Perfectly. Purring like it had never had a problem. He rolled down the window. That's amazing. How much do I owe you? Walter shook his head. Nothing. Happy to help a traveler in need. No, I insist, Lewis said, reaching for his wallet. Walter raised a hand. Tell you what, the rain's letting up. Why not have a cup of tea before you go? I don't get many visitors out here. Lewis checked the time. His family wasn't expecting him for another hour. And something about this old mechanic and his time capsule garage made him curious. Tea sounds great, Lewis said. And then you'll let me pay you properly? Walter smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. We'll see about that. As Walter put the kettle on, Lewis glanced once more at the racing photos on the wall. There was something special about this place, and about Walter Morris himself. Sugar? Walter asked, placing 2 mugs on the small table in the corner of the garage. No thanks, Lewis replied, still looking at the photos. You have quite a collection of racing pictures here. Walter poured the tea and followed Lewis's gaze to the wall. Something flickered across his face. Pride, maybe, or sadness. It was hard to tell. Just memories, Walter said. From a long time ago. Lewis stepped closer to one photo showing a sleek race car taking a corner at what looked like the old Monza circuit in Italy. The driving style looked familiar somehow. Were you a racing fan? Lewis asked. Walter handed Lewis a mug of tea. You could say that. He changed the subject quickly. So, you work with cars, too? Lewis took a sip of his tea. Yes, I'm actually a race driver. Ah, Walter said, nodding. That explains your interest in the photos. What sort of racing? Formula One, Lewis said, waiting for the usual reaction of surprise and excitement. Walter simply nodded again. Tough sport. Requires skill and courage. There was no sign he recognized Lewis as a champion. They sat at the small table. Lewis noticed Walter's hands. They were weathered and spotted with age, but the fingers were long and nimble, without the shakiness you might expect in someone his age. How long have you had this garage? Lewis asked. Opened it in 1969, Walter said. This used to be my father's workshop. He fixed farm equipment. I turned it into a garage when I came back home. Came back from where? Walter looked into his tea. From another life. He smiled, but his eyes remained distant. Before Lewis could ask more, Walter pointed to the Mercedes through the window. That's a beautiful machine you've got. The AMG series is masterfully engineered. Lewis was surprised by Walter's knowledge. You know Mercedes well? I try to keep up with the modern cars, even out here in the countryside. Can't fix what you don't understand. Walter sipped his tea. Though sometimes I think the basics haven't changed much. An engine is still an engine. That's true, Lewis agreed, though racing engines have become incredibly complex. Walter's eyes lit up. But the principles remain, don't they? It's all about power, balance, and control. For the next 20 minutes, they talked about engines. Lewis was amazed by Walter's knowledge. The old man spoke about mechanical engineering like a professor, but in simple, clear terms. He understood concepts that Lewis had only learned after years in racing. When they finished their tea, Lewis insisted on paying for the repair. Walter refused again, but Lewis left money on the table anyway. At least, let me know what was wrong. With my car, Lewis said, so I can tell my team. Walter walked back to the Mercedes with Lewis. It was simple, really. Your cooling system had a hairline crack, hard to spot unless you know exactly where to look. And here, he pointed under. The hood? This connection was loose. Small problems, but they can cause big trouble. Louis peered where Walter was pointing. Even knowing what to look for, he could barely see the crack Walter had found. "How did you spot that?" Louis asked. Most mechanics would have used diagnostic computers first. Walter tapped the side of his head. "When you've worked on engines for over 60 years, you develop a feel for them. Computers are useful, but they can't feel or hear the way a human can." Louis thought about the Mercedes racing team's garage, filled with engineers and high-tech equipment. Yet here was Walter, fixing problems with just his eyes and hands. "I should get going," Louis said, checking the time. "My family's expecting me." "Drive safely," Walter said. "The roads will still be slick from the rain." Louis started the car, rolled down the window, and hesitated. He felt a strange connection to this old mechanic and his timeless garage. "Walter, do you mind if I stop by again sometime? Maybe next week?" Surprise crossed Walter's face, then a genuine smile. "Doors always open. Not many people appreciate a good talk about engines these days." Louis waved as he pulled away. In his rear-view mirror, he saw Walter standing in front of Morris Motors, looking suddenly small against the old building. The Mercedes ran perfectly all the way to his parents' house in Stevenage. As Louis greeted his family and settled in for dinner, his mind kept drifting back to Walter and those racing photos on the garage wall. The next morning, Louis woke early and checked his phone. There were messages from his race engineer about the upcoming German Grand Prix. The team was still struggling to understand what had gone wrong with his car at Silverstone. Over breakfast, Louis searched online for Walter Morris Mechanic. Nothing relevant came up. He tried Walter Morris Racing and found a few mentions in old newspaper archives from the 1960s, but no clear information. Louis's father joined him at the breakfast table. "What's got you so focused this morning? Thought you were taking a break from racing for a couple of days." Louis put down his phone. "Dad, do you remember anyone named Walter Morris? He'd be in his 70s now. Might have been a racer or mechanic back in the day." His father thought for a moment. "Name rings a bell, but I can't place it. Why do you ask?" Louis told him about the breakdown in Walter's garage. "There's something about him. He knew exactly what was wrong with the car, fixed it in no time. And his garage has all these old racing photos." "Sounds like one of the old-school mechanics," his father said. "They're a dying breed. Those guys could diagnose a problem just by listening to an engine." That afternoon, Louis drove back to his flat in London. All the way, he thought about Walter's simple solution to his car trouble. If a hairline crack could cause his road car to break down, could something similar be affecting his race car? Louis called his race engineer, Pete. "Louis, good to hear from you," Pete said. "We're still analyzing the data from Silverstone." "I've been thinking," Louis said. "What if we're overlooking something simple? Maybe it's not a software issue or something in the engine mapping." "What? If it's a small mechanical problem?" "Like what?" Pete sounded skeptical. "I don't know exactly, but sometimes the simplest explanation is the right one. We've checked everything, Louis. All the major systems are functioning normally. Maybe we need to look at the connections between systems," Louis suggested, thinking of how Walter had found the loose connection in his Mercedes. "Places where things join together." There was a pause on the line. "That's actually not a bad idea. We've been focusing on individual components. I'll have the team look at the interfaces." After hanging up, Louis stared out the window of his flat, watching the London traffic below. He couldn't stop thinking about Walter's calm confidence and the knowing look in his eyes when he fixed the car. A week passed. The team found a minor issue with Louis's race car, a connection point in the cooling system that was causing intermittent problems, similar to what Walter had discovered in his road car. They fixed it, and the car's performance improved in testing. Louis had meetings, training sessions, and sponsor events all week, but his mind kept returning to the small garage in the countryside and the old mechanic with the weathered hands. One morning, Louis made a decision. He got in his car, the same silver Mercedes that Walter had fixed, and drove back toward Stevenage. This time, he brought coffee and pastries from a bakery in London. As he pulled up to Morris Motors, Louis saw Walter outside, wiping down an old Jaguar E-Type. The old man looked up, surprised, then smiled as Louis stepped out of the car with the coffee and pastry box. "Thought you might like breakfast," Louis said. Walter's smile grew wider. "Well, isn't this a nice surprise? The car running all right?" "Perfect," Louis replied. "Better than ever, thanks to you." They went inside, and Louis noticed the racing photos again. This time, he was determined to learn more about the man who could fix a modern Mercedes with nothing but old tools and experienced hands. "I brought you coffee," Louis said, setting the cardboard cups and pastry box on the small table. "I didn't know how you take it, so I got cream and sugar on the side." Walter looked pleased. "Black is perfect. Been drinking it that way since 1962. He opened the pastry box. "These look too fancy to eat." "They're from a bakery in London," Louis said. "Their pain au chocolat is amazing." They sat at the table, and Walter took a careful bite of pastry. His eyes lit up. "That's proper baking. Reminds me of France." "You've been to France?" Louis asked, seizing the opportunity. Walter nodded. "Many times, years ago." Louis turned his chair slightly toward the wall of photos. "Those tracks in your pictures, Monaco, Monza, Silverstone, did you visit them when you were in Europe?" Walter followed his gaze. He seemed to consider his words carefully. "Yes, I saw quite a bit of Europe in my younger days." "As a racing fan?" Walter took a sip of coffee. "Something like that." Louis pointed to one photo showing a group of men standing beside a race car. "Is that you there?" Walter squinted at the photo. "Sharp eyes you've got." "Yes, that's me, long time ago." In the picture, a much younger Walter stood proudly next to what looked like a Formula 2 car from the mid-1960s. He wore racing overalls with a team badge that Louis couldn't quite make out. "Were you a mechanic back then, too?" Louis asked. Walter's fingers tapped lightly on his coffee cup. "Among other things." He changed the subject. "How's your Formula 1 team doing? Getting ready for the next race?" Louis was surprised. "You remembered I drive Formula 1? Course I did. Not every day a race driver breaks down outside my garage." Walter smiled, "Though you never said which team." "Mercedes," Louis said. "I've been with them for years now." Walter nodded. "Good outfit. They've come a long way since their Silver Arrows days." Louis was impressed by Walter's knowledge. "You follow modern racing?" "I keep an eye on it." "Hard not to when you love engines as much as I do." Walter took another bite of pastry. "Actually, there's a small TV in the back room. I watch the races when I can, between fixing village cars." Louis decided to be direct. "You knew who I was when I came in last week, didn't you?" Walter's eyes twinkled. "I had my suspicions, but you seem to be enjoying not being recognized. Thought I'd give you that piece." Louis felt a rush of gratitude toward the old mechanic. "Thank you. That doesn't happen often. Everyone needs a break from being themselves sometimes." Walter brushed crumbs from his fingers. "So, what brings you back to my humble garage? Surely not just to deliver fancy pastries to an old man." Louis smiled. "Actually, I wanted to thank you properly. Your fix gave me an idea about my race car. We found a similar problem, a connection point issue, and fixed it. The car's running much better now." Walter nodded. "Simple things can cause big problems. Glad I could help, even accidentally." "It wasn't accidental," Lewis said. "It was your experience, the way you think about cars." He hesitated, then decided to take a chance. "Actually, I was wondering if you'd look at some data from my recent races. Maybe you'd see something our engineers missed." Walter raised his eyebrows. "Me? Give advice to Mercedes' Formula One team?" He chuckled. "I'm just an old man in a country garage." "An old man who found in minutes what my car's onboard computers couldn't detect," Lewis replied. He pulled out his phone. "Just have a look. No pressure." Walter wiped his hands clean and took the phone. Lewis had pulled up graphs showing his car's performance data from Silverstone. Walter studied them carefully, his fingers tracing lines on the screen. "This is from your last race?" Walter asked. "Yes. You can see where performance dropped in sectors 2 and 3. Walter nodded, swiping through more screens. His eyes moved quickly over the data, seeming to absorb everything. For someone his age, he was remarkably comfortable with the technology. "What does your team think the problem is?" Walter asked. "They're focused on the power unit mapping or a sensor issue. We've replaced several parts already." Walter handed the phone back to Lewis. "Your team is looking at the symptoms, not the cause." "What do you mean?" "See here?" Walter took the phone again and pointed to a section of the data. "Your temperature readings spike before the performance drops. It's slight, easy to miss." Lewis leaned closer. "I see it. This reminds me of something I saw years ago. With these modern materials and tight tolerances, expansion from heat can create micro-movements." Walter's finger traced another line on the graph. "I'd bet there's a connection point that's ever so slightly loose, but only when the components reach a certain temperature." Lewis stared at Walter. "That's actually brilliant, and it makes perfect sense. Pete, my engineer, mentioned something similar, but we didn't connect it to the temperature pattern." Walter handed the phone back. "It's just a theory. Your engineers know their car best." "No, this is exactly the kind of fresh perspective we need." Lewis was excited now. "The way you look at problems, it's different. You see the whole picture." Walter seemed embarrassed by the praise. "When you've been around engines as long as I have, you develop instincts." Lewis took a sip of his coffee, thinking. Then he asked, "Walter, where did you learn so much about racing engines?" The old man looked toward the wall of photos, his eyes distant. "Here and there, you pick things up." Before Lewis could press further, the garage's phone rang. Walter excused himself to answer it. Lewis heard him talking to someone about a farm tractor that needed repair. When Walter returned, Lewis had made up his mind. "I have an idea," he said. "Would you be interested in coming to a race?" "As my guest?" Walter looked startled. "Me? At a Formula One race?" "Yes. The German Grand Prix is next weekend at Hockenheim. I could fly you there, show you our garage, introduce you to the team." Walter's expression was hard to read. He looked both intrigued and troubled. "That's very kind, but I haven't been to a race It's been decades." "All the more reason to come," Lewis said. "See how things have changed. Maybe share some of your insights with our engineers." Walter walked slowly to the wall of photos. He touched one frame gently, a picture of the old Hockenheim circuit with its long forest straights. "Strange coincidence, you mentioning Germany." "Is that a yes?" Lewis asked hopefully. Walter turned back to face Lewis. "I haven't left this village in over 15 years." Lewis was surprised. 15 years? Not even for a holiday? No need. Everything I want is here. Walter gestured around the garage. My tools, my few customers, my memories. But don't you miss it? The excitement? The sound of the engines? Walter's eyes took on a faraway look. Sometimes. But racing tracks hold difficult memories for me. Louis sensed there was much more to the story. I won't pressure you, but the offer stands. Walter nodded slowly. Let me think about it. It's been a long time since I've been around that world. Of course, Louis said. Take your time. As Louis prepared to leave, he glanced once more at the photos. These pictures tell quite a story. Walter smiled faintly. Only part of it. He walked Louis to the door. Thank you for the coffee and pastries, and for thinking of an old mechanic. I'll call you in a couple of days about Germany, Louis asked. I'll be here, Walter replied. I'm always here. As Louis drove away, he couldn't stop thinking about Walter's reaction. What memories made him stay away from races for so long? And why had he isolated himself in this tiny garage for 15 years? Louis was more determined than ever to learn the story of Walter Morris. Back at his flat in London, Louis couldn't stop thinking about Walter. He called Pete, his chief engineer. I need you to look into something, Louis said after they'd discussed the upcoming race. What's up? Pete asked. There's this mechanic I met, Walter Morris. He gave me an idea about our cooling system issue. I want to know if he's worked in racing before. Walter Morris? Pete repeated. Never heard of him. How old is this guy? Late 70s, I think. Would have been active in the 60s. That's before my time, Pete said. But I'll ask around. Thanks, Louis said. And one more thing. I'm thinking of bringing him to Hockenheim as my guest. There was a pause on the line. You want to bring an elderly mechanic you just met to the German Grand Prix? Toto won't like a stranger in the garage. He's not just any mechanic, Louis explained. He spotted things in our data that we missed. I think he could help us. If you say so, Pete sounded doubtful. I'll clear it with the team. 2 days later, Louis drove back to Walter's garage. This time he brought some of Mercedes's most detailed technical documents, things the team normally kept highly secret. Walter was working on an old Land Rover when Louis arrived. His face brightened when he saw Louis. Back so soon? Walter wiped his hands on a rag. Your car running all right? Perfect, Louis said. I came to follow up on our conversation. About Germany? Walter's smile faded slightly. Ah, yes. I've been thinking about that. And? Walter gestured toward the small room at the back of the garage. Let's have some tea. In the back room, Louis noticed more racing memorabilia. Old racing gloves, a helmet from the 1960s, and trophies tucked away on a dusty shelf. Walter put the kettle on and sat heavily in an old armchair. It's been a long time since I've been to a racetrack, Louis. I'm not sure I belong there anymore. Because of those difficult memories you mentioned? Louis asked gently. Walter nodded. Racing was everything to me once. But things changed. Life changed. What happened? Louis asked. Walter stared at his weathered hands. It's not a simple story. I've got time, Louis said, sitting across from him. The kettle whistled, and Walter rose to make the tea. When he returned with 2 steaming mugs, his expression was resolved. You're persistent, Walter said with a small smile. I'll tell you this much. I was involved in racing quite seriously. Then, in 1968, there was an accident. After that, I left the sport. Never went back. I'm sorry, Louis said. Was it your accident? Walter nodded slowly. Mine and someone else's. That's all I can say for now. Lewis respected the old man's privacy. I understand. But would coming to Hockenheim be too difficult for you? Walter sipped his tea thoughtfully. Maybe it's time to face old ghosts. But I haven't traveled in years. Haven't even been on an airplane since 1980. I can arrange everything, Lewis said eagerly. Private flight, comfortable hotel. You won't have to deal with crowds or confusion. Why is this so important to you? Walter asked, his blue eyes searching Lewis's face. Lewis thought about it. Partly because I think you could help our team. But honestly, I'm curious about you. Your knowledge, your experience. There's something special about the way you understand racing. Walter seemed touched. At my age, not many people think you have anything valuable to offer. They're wrong, Lewis said firmly. I think you know more about racing than most people in the paddock. Walter's face showed a mixture of emotions: pride, hesitation, and something like fear. He stood and walked to a cabinet in the corner. From it, he pulled out an old photograph album. Have a look at this, Walter said, handing it to Lewis. It might explain a few things. Lewis opened the album carefully. The first pages showed a much younger Walter in racing overalls, standing proudly beside various race cars. As Lewis turned the pages, he saw Walter in winner's circles, shaking hands with racing legends like Jim Clark and Graham Hill. You were a driver, Lewis said, amazed. Walter nodded. For 7 years. Started in Formula 3, moved up to Formula 2, and then… Formula 1? Lewis asked, staring at a photo of Walter in what was clearly an F1 car. Just a few races, Walter said modestly. I was never a star, but I held my own. Lewis turned another page and saw Walter on a podium at Silverstone. You won races, some smaller ones. One non-championship F1 race. Nothing like what you've accomplished. Lewis looked up from the album. Why isn't your name better known? You should be a British racing legend. Walter took the album back gently. After I left racing, I wanted to be forgotten. I turned down interviews, avoided reunions. Eventually, people respected my wishes. Because of the accident? Walter closed the album. Yes. Lewis leaned forward. Walter, coming to Germany, seeing modern racing up close, it might give you some peace. And selfishly, I'd love to have your insights about my car. Walter was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, if I do come, I'd need to keep a low profile. No special introductions or attention. Lewis felt a surge of excitement. Absolutely. You'd just be my guest. No one needs to know your history. And I'd want to come back home right after the race. No celebrations or press. I promise, Lewis said. I'll arrange everything exactly how you want it. Walter looked around his small room at the mementos of his racing past. It's been 57 years since I've been to Hockenheim. The track is different now, Lewis said. They shortened it in 2002. I know, Walter said. I've watched it change on television. The old Forest Straights are gone. Lewis realized Walter had been following racing all these years, even while staying away from it physically. So, is that a yes? Lewis asked hopefully. Walter took a deep breath. Yes, I'll come to Germany. God help me, but I'll come. Lewis broke into a wide smile. You won't regret it. I'll take care of everything. There's just one more thing, Walter said, his face serious. I need to bring something with me, an old racing bag. It's important to me. Of course, Lewis said. Whatever you need. They talked for another hour about the logistics. Walter was nervous about flying in crowds, but Lewis assured him that As a Formula One driver, he was used to arranging private travel. When Lewis finally left, Walter walked him to his car. "I never expected to go back," Walter said quietly. "Not after all these years." "Sometimes life takes unexpected turns," Lewis replied, "like my car breaking down outside your garage." Walter smiled. Maybe it wasn't just chance. Lewis thought about that as he drove away. The odds of his car breaking down right near the garage of a former racing driver, one who had exactly the knowledge to help with his current car problems, seemed too perfect to be pure coincidence. He called Pete again from the car. "He's coming," Lewis said. Walter agreed to come to Germany. "Great," Pete said. "By the way, I asked around about him. Found some interesting things." "Like what?" Lewis asked. Walter Morris was a rising star in the mid-60s, won the British F2 Championship in 1966, had a few F1 drives in 67 and 68. Then he disappeared after a crash at, get this, Hockenheim. Lewis nearly swerved the car in surprise. "Hockenheim? No wonder he was hesitant." "There's more," Pete said. "But it might be better to tell you in person." "Tell me now," Lewis insisted. Pete sighed. The accident wasn't just bad for Morris. Another driver was killed, young guy named Michael Hayes. Lewis felt a chill. The name sounded vaguely familiar, but he couldn't place it. "Thanks for telling me," Lewis said. "I'll see you at the factory tomorrow." As Lewis drove through the English countryside, he wondered what other secrets Walter was keeping, and what it would mean for both of them when those secrets came to light in Germany. The day before the German Grand Prix, Lewis sent a car to pick up Walter. He'd arranged everything carefully: a private driver, a quiet route to the airport, and a comfortable private plane waiting for them. Lewis met Walter at a small private airfield near London. The old mechanic arrived carrying a worn leather bag, just as he'd mentioned. He looked nervous, but determined. "Good morning," Lewis greeted him. "Ready for the adventure?" Walter glanced at the small private jet on the runway. "As ready as I'll ever be." Lewis noticed Walter clutching his old leather bag tightly. "Is that all you're bringing?" Walter nodded. "Don't need much for 2 days." As they walked toward the plane, Lewis asked, "What's in the bag? You mentioned it was important." Walter hesitated, then unzipped it slightly. Inside, Lewis glimpsed an old racing cap and a pair of leather gloves, racing gear from another era. "Mementos," Walter said, closing the bag. "Thought I might need them for courage." The flight to Germany would take less than 2 hours. As they settled into the comfortable leather seats, Walter looked out the window. "Last time I flew was 1980, he said. "My wife was still alive then. We went to Italy for our anniversary." "You were married?" Lewis asked. 32 years, Walter said with a sad smile. "Margaret passed in 1999. She was the one who helped me open the garage after I left racing." "I'm sorry," Lewis said. Walter nodded in thanks. "It's been a quiet life since she went. Just me and the garage." As the plane took off, Walter gripped the armrests tightly. Lewis tried to distract him by showing photos of the Mercedes team and explaining how modern Formula One worked. "It's so different now," Walter said, looking at pictures of the team's high-tech garage. "In my day, we had maybe 5 mechanics. Now you have dozens of engineers, computers, everywhere." "The basics are still the same," Lewis said. "Driver, car, track." Walter smiled. "And the fear. That's still the same, I bet." Fear? That moment before the start. The knowledge that anything can happen. Walter looked out the window at the clouds. Some things never change. Lewis was curious about Walter's racing career. "Pete, my engineer, looked you up. Said you were British F2 champion." In 1966, Walter seemed embarrassed. That was a good year. And you raced in F1? 8 races, Walter said. My best finish was 4th at Brands Hatch in '67. Not a stellar career by your standards. Still impressive, Lewis said. Racing was much more dangerous then. Walter's face darkened. Yes, we lost too many good men. Lewis wanted to ask about Michael Hayes and the accident, but Walter's expression warned him away from the topic. Instead, he asked, "What was your favorite track?" Walter's eyes lit up. Monaco. Driving there was like dancing with danger. Every corner, a new partner. For the rest of the flight, Walter shared stories about racing in the 1960s. He spoke about Jim Clark's smooth driving style, Graham Hill's determination, and the camaraderie among drivers despite the dangers they faced. We knew any race could be our last, Walter said. Made us live more fully, I suppose. When they landed in Germany, a Mercedes team car was waiting for them. Walter grew quiet as they drove toward Hockenheim. Lewis noticed his hands trembling. Slightly. You okay? Lewis asked. Walter nodded stiffly. Just memories. As they approached the circuit, Walter stared out the window intently. The modern Hockenheim ring came into view. It's so different, Walter murmured. The old track went deep into the forest. Long straights where you'd hit top speed, surrounded by trees. Beautiful and terrifying. Lewis had only raced on the modern, shortened circuit. I've seen photos of the old layout. Must have been incredible. It was, Walter said quietly. Until it wasn't. They arrived at the circuit and drove through a private entrance, avoiding the crowds of fans. Lewis had arranged for Walter to have full access to the Mercedes areas without having to deal with the busy paddock. As they walked into the Mercedes garage, Walter seemed overwhelmed by the technology surrounding him. Engineers worked at computer stations, mechanics prepared the cars, and screens displayed endless streams of data. Pete approached them. Lewis, everything's set for practice. He turned to Walter and extended his hand. You must be Mr. Morris. I'm Pete Cranham, chief engineer. Walter shook his hand. Just Walter, please. Pete gave Lewis a meaningful look, and Lewis knew his engineer had discovered more about Walter's past. Let me show you around, Lewis said to Walter. You can see how different things are now. As they toured the garage, Walter asked surprisingly technical questions. The engineers were impressed by his knowledge, especially when Walter suggested a small adjustment to the cooling system based on what he'd seen in Lewis's data. He knows his stuff, Pete whispered to Lewis as Walter examined the car. Hard to believe he's been away from racing for 50 years. He hasn't been away in his mind, Lewis replied. Just physically. After the tour, Lewis took Walter to the hotel where he'd booked him a quiet room away from the other teams and media. Walter seemed tired from the journey. Get some rest, Lewis suggested. Tomorrow will be a big day. Walter nodded, still clutching his leather bag. Thank you for this, Lewis, for bringing me back. I should be thanking you, Lewis said. Your insights about the car are already helping us. Walter smiled faintly. Strange to be useful again. He looked out the hotel window, toward the circuit in the distance. Strange to be here again. As Lewis left Walter to rest, he checked his phone. There was a message from his mother. How's Germany? Dad told me about the old mechanic you met. What was his name again? Lewis texted back. Walter Morris. He used to race in the '60s. His mother replied quickly. Morris? Ask him if he knew cousin Twywent. Michael Hayes. He died in a racing accident in Germany before I was born. Your grandmother always talked about him. Lewis stopped walking, staring at his phone in shock. Michael Hayes, the same name Pete had mentioned, the driver who died in Walter's accident. And he was Lewis's mother's cousin? Lewis felt a chill run down his spine. This couldn't be coincidence. But had Walter known all along? Was this why he'd helped Lewis that rainy day? With these questions spinning in his mind, Lewis headed to the team meeting, wondering what tomorrow would bring when Walter faced the track where his life had changed forever. The track connected to Lewis's own family. History. Lewis couldn't focus during the team meeting. The engineers discussed strategy and setup options, but his mind kept returning to his mother's text message. Michael Hayes, his mother's cousin, had died in Walter's accident. After the meeting, Lewis pulled Pete aside. "What else did you find out about Walter Morris and Michael Hayes?" Lewis asked. Pete looked surprised. "Not much more than I told you. Hayes was a young driver, first season in F1. The accident happened during practice for the German Grand Prix in 1968. Why? Michael Hayes was my mother's cousin," Lewis said quietly. Pete's eyes widened. "Are you serious? That's quite a connection. Does Walter know who I am? I mean, beyond being Lewis Hamilton, the F1 driver?" "No idea," Pete said. "But it seems like a massive coincidence that he'd end up helping you specifically." Lewis nodded. "I need to talk to him, but not yet. Let's get through tomorrow's practice first." The next morning, Lewis sent a car to bring Walter to the track. When the elderly man arrived at the garage, he looked like he hadn't slept much. His face was pale, but his eyes were alert. "Good morning," Lewis greeted him. "How are you feeling?" "Like I've gone back in time," Walter said. "And yet, everything is different." Lewis introduced Walter to more team members. The technical director, James, joined them. "Lewis tells me you spotted something in our cooling system data," James said, clearly skeptical but polite. Walter nodded. "Just a pattern I recognized. Similar to problems we had in the old days, though your systems are much more advanced." James T. Hyde pulled up some data on a screen. "We've been having an issue with performance dropping in high-temperature conditions. Lewis's car more than his teammates. We've replaced several components, but the problem persists." Walter studied the screen carefully. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to the keyboard. James hesitated, then nodded. Walter typed slowly but confidently, pulling up different screens and comparing data sets. "Here," Walter said finally. "Look at the temperature variance between these 2 points." He pointed to tiny discrepancies in the readings. "This suggests a harmonic vibration is developing when certain parts heat up. The tolerances are so small in modern cars that even microscopic expansion can cause issues." James looked where Walter pointed. His expression changed from doubt to interest. "We check for vibrations, of course," James said, "but not specifically tied to these temperature patterns. In my day, we could feel such things through the chassis," Walter explained. "The driver's body was the best sensor. Now you have computers for everything, which is better in many ways. But sometimes you miss the things that aren't being directly measured." Lewis watched as the technical team gathered around Walter. The old mechanic explained his theory in clear, simple terms that even Lewis could follow. Walter suggested a minor modification to a bracket that held part of the cooling system, a small change that might solve the vibration problem. "It's worth trying," James admitted. "We can make this adjustment before practice." "Thank you for the suggestion, Mr. Morris," the team principal, Toto, said, having joined the group. "It's refreshing to have a different perspective." Walter seemed embarrassed by the attention. Just an old man's thoughts. The mechanics got to work implementing Walter's suggestion. Lewis took Walter for coffee while they waited. "How does it feel to be back in a Formula One garage?" Lewis asked. Overwhelming, Walter admitted. So much has changed. In my day, we'd adjust the carburetors with a screwdriver. Now everything is computers and carbon fiber. But the principles are the same, Lewis said. Walter nodded. Racing is still racing. Man and machine against time. Lewis wanted to ask about Michael Hayes, but couldn't find the right words. Instead, he asked, "Will you watch practice from the garage?" "If that's all right," Walter said. "I'd like to see if my idea helps." When they returned to the garage, the cars were ready for practice. Lewis suited up, while Walter found a quiet spot to observe. The old man seemed deep in thought as he watched the activity around him. Lewis climbed into his car, trying to focus on the session ahead. As the team pushed his car to the pit lane, he glanced back at Walter. The elderly mechanic gave him a small nod, as if saying, "Good luck, the practice." Session went surprisingly well. Lewis felt a difference in the car immediately. It was more stable through the high-speed corners where they'd been having trouble. By the end of the session, he had set the fastest time, nearly half a second quicker than anyone else. When Lewis returned to the garage, the engineers were ecstatic. The data showed that the vibration issue was gone, and the cooling system was working perfectly. Walter's simple fix had solved a problem that had been troubling them for months. "It worked," James exclaimed, showing Walter the readings. "The temperature pattern is completely stable now." Walter smiled modestly. Sometimes the simplest solutions are the best. The team gathered around, congratulating Walter. Even Toto looked impressed. "Where did you learn about racing cars, Mr. Morris?" Toto asked. Walter glanced at Lewis before answering. "I used to be involved in the sport. Many years ago, one of the older photographers who'd been taking pictures of the car looked up suddenly. He stared at Walter with a shocked expression. "Wait," the photographer said. "Walter Morris? The Walter Morris who raced in the 60s? Walter shifted uncomfortably as heads turned toward him. "That was another lifetime," Walter said quietly. The photographer stepped closer. "I thought you looked familiar. I was just starting out when you were racing. You were British F2 champion." A murmur went through the team as people realized they had a former racing driver in their midst. Walter looked increasingly uncomfortable. "With the attention." "It was a long time ago," Walter said. "I'm just a garage mechanic now." Toto looked at Lewis with raised eyebrows, clearly surprised that Lewis hadn't mentioned Walter's background. Lewis shrugged apologetically. "Well, Mr. Morris," Toto said, "your experience is clearly valuable. Would you mind taking a closer look at our car setup for tomorrow? We would appreciate your insights." Walter hesitated, then nodded. "I'd be honored, though your engineers know far more than I do about modern cars." "Sometimes fresh eyes see what experts miss," Toto said, "especially eyes with your experience." For the next hour, Walter worked with the engineers, examining every aspect of the car. His questions were insightful, showing a deep understanding of racing principles that transcended the technological changes of the past 50 years. At one point, Walter asked for a folding chair to be placed beside the car. He sat there, studying the lines of the Mercedes, occasionally asking a mechanic to check something specific. "What's he doing?" James asked Lewis quietly. "I think he's listening to the car," Lewis replied. In his own way, by late afternoon, Walter had suggested several minor adjustments to the car's setup. None were dramatic changes, but together they might improve performance significantly. "We'll implement these for qualifying tomorrow," James told Lewis. "Your friend has an incredible eye for detail." As the team's work wound down for the day, Lewis found Walter sitting alone, staring at the car. The old man looked tired but satisfied. "You've made quite an impression," Lewis said, sitting beside him. Walter shook his head. I just offered a few old-fashioned ideas. Your team did the real work. You solved a problem that's been bothering us for months. Walter shrugged. Lucky guess. Louis decided it was time to ask the question that had been on his mind all day. Walter, he said carefully, did you know who I was when I showed up at your garage that rainy day? I mean, besides being a Formula One driver? Walter's eyes met Louis's. There was a long pause before he answered. No, he said finally. Not at first. I just saw a young man with a broken-down car. But later, Walter looked away. Later, I wondered. There was something about you that seemed familiar. But I wasn't certain until I came here. Saw you with your team. What seemed familiar? Louis pressed gently. Walter stood up slowly. It's been a long day. Would you mind if we continue this conversation tomorrow? After qualifying? Louis nodded. Of course. I'll have the car take you back to the hotel. As Walter gathered his things, Louis noticed him glancing toward the track entrance, visible through the garage opening. There was a weight of history in that gaze, 57 years of memories, some too painful to share. Tomorrow, Louis thought. Tomorrow he would learn the truth about Walter Morris and Michael Hayes. Louis woke early the next morning. He hadn't slept well, his mind full of questions about Walter and Michael Hayes. He texted his mother. Did anyone in the family ever mention Walter Morris? Her reply came quickly. Not that I remember. Grandma didn't talk much about the accident. It was too painful. Louis showered and dressed, then went to pick up Walter for breakfast. The hotel restaurant was quiet at 7 a.m., allowing them to talk privately. Walter looked better than yesterday. There was more color in his face, and his eyes were bright. He was already on his second cup of coffee when Louis arrived. Morning, Walter greeted him. Slept better than I expected. Good to hear, Louis said, sitting across from him. Big day today. They ordered breakfast, and Walter gazed out the window at the misty morning. I've been thinking about your car. The balance seemed slightly off in the final sector yesterday. Louis was surprised. The engineers mentioned the same thing. They're making adjustments, Walter nodded, stirring his coffee. Racing hasn't changed so much. Still trying to find that perfect balance. As they ate, Walter talked about his morning walks in the English countryside, how he loved watching the seasons change, and the peace he found in his simple life. Louis realized that, despite Walter's obvious love for racing, he'd found contentment in his quiet existence. Do you ever regret leaving racing? Louis asked. Walter set down his fork. Sometimes. I miss the challenge, the excitement. But after what happened? He shook his head. It was the right decision. Because of the accident? Walter nodded. After Michael died, I couldn't see the track the same way. This was the first time Walter had mentioned Michael Hayes directly. Louis took a deep breath. Walter, there's something I need to tell you. Just then, Louis's phone rang. It was Pete, calling about urgent setup changes before qualifying. Louis apologized to Walter and took the call, watching as the old man returned to his breakfast, seemingly relieved by the interruption. After breakfast, they headed to the circuit. The paddock was busy with teams preparing for qualifying. As they walked through the Mercedes hospitality area, Louis introduced Walter to several people, including Sir Jackie Stewart, who was visiting the team. To Louis's surprise, Stewart's eyes widened in recognition. Morris? Walter Morris? Walter seemed shocked to be recognized. Sir Jackie, it's been a long time. My God, Stewart exclaimed, shaking Walter's hand warmly. I haven't seen you since, must be 1968. He turned to Louis. You know who this man is? One of the smoothest drivers I ever raced against. Could have been champion with the right car. Walter looked embarrassed. You're too kind, Jackie. Stewart clapped Walter on the shoulder. Where have you been all these years? You disappeared completely. Small garage in the English countryside, Walter said. Fixing everyday cars instead of racing them. What a waste of talent, Stewart said, though his tone was gentle. Though after what happened here, I understood why you left. An uncomfortable silence fell between them. Lewis watched Walter's face carefully. I should let you prepare for qualifying, Walter said to Lewis, clearly wanting to end the conversation. Nonsense, Stewart said. You must tell me what you think of modern Formula One. I bet we have similar opinions about all these computers and complicated regulations. For the next 15 minutes, the two racing veterans talked about the changes in the sport. Walter gradually relaxed, even laughing at some of Stewart's stories about their racing days. Lewis listened, fascinated by this glimpse into racing history. When Stewart finally left to meet other commitments, Walter seemed both drained and invigorated by the encounter. He was always a gentleman, Walter said, even in the fiercest competitions. You never told me you knew Jackie Stewart, Lewis said. Walter smiled faintly. Oh, sådan tiderten. There's a lot I haven't told you. They continued their tour of the paddock. Several older team members and officials seemed to recognize Walter, always with the same surprised reaction. One elderly mechanic from another team actually had tears in his eyes when he saw Walter. We thought you were dead, the man said bluntly. No one had seen you in so long. Not dead, Walter replied. Just hiding. These encounters clearly took a toll on Walter. By the time they returned to the Mercedes garage, he looked exhausted. Lewis found him a quiet spot to rest before qualifying. You don't have to stay for qualifying if it's too much, Lewis told him. I want to see your car on track, Walter insisted, after all the adjustments we made. As the qualifying session approached, Walter gave Lewis some final advice. In the stadium section, wait a heartbeat longer before turning in to the first. Right-hander. The car will rotate better. Lewis was surprised by the specific suggestion. How do you know? I watched your lines yesterday, Walter said. Some corners never change, even when the track does. In the garage, Walter stood quietly in the background as the team made final preparations. Lewis could see him observing everything with expert eyes. It reminded Lewis of how his father used to watch him race karts as a child, seeing details others missed. Qualifying went even better than practice. Lewis followed Walter's advice about the stadium section and found the car rotating perfectly. Through the corner, he secured pole position with a lap time nearly 4/10 faster than anyone else. When Lewis returned to the garage, the team was jubilant. The engineers credited the improvements to Walter's suggestions. Walter accepted their thanks modestly, but Lewis could see pride in his eyes, the pride of a racing man whose knowledge still mattered. After the post-qualifying interviews, Lewis found Walter staring at the timing screens. The old driver seemed lost in thought. We did it, Lewis said. Pole position, Walter nodded. Your driving was beautiful. So precise. I used your suggestion in the stadium section. It worked perfectly, Walter smiled. Racing knowledge doesn't expire, I suppose. As the team celebrated around them, Lewis noticed Walter watching the mechanics with a complex mix of emotions on his face. Joy, sadness, and something like longing. Come to the podium area tomorrow if we win, Lewis said impulsively. Be part of the celebration. Walter shook his head. No, that's your moment. I'll watch from the garage. At least come to the team celebration afterward. Walter hesitated, then nodded. All right, but no fuss about me, please. As they walked back to the hospitality area, Walter suddenly stopped and looked out toward the track. "I haven't told you everything, Lewis. About me, about Michael Hayes." "I know," Lewis said quietly. Walter turned to him. "After the celebration tomorrow, I promise I'll explain everything." Lewis put a hand on Walter's shoulder. The old man felt thin and fragile under his racing jacket. But there was still strength in him, the strength that had carried him through tragedy and 5 decades of self-imposed exile. "Whatever it is," Lewis said, "it won't change the fact that you've helped us, helped me." Walter's eyes were sad but determined. "Tomorrow, then, after the race." As Walter walked away, Lewis wondered what revelations the next day would bring and how they would change his understanding of his own family history. Race day dawned clear and cool at Hockenheim. Lewis arrived at the track early for final preparations. To his surprise, Walter was already there, standing alone at the edge of the track, staring at the empty circuit. "You're up early," Lewis said, joining him. Walter didn't look away from the track. "Couldn't sleep. First time I've been here on race day since 1968. Lewis followed Walter's gaze. "It must be strange, seeing how much it's changed." "The trees are the same," Walter said quietly. "The forest around the track. That's what I remember most from the accident." Looking up at the trees afterward, Lewis hesitated, then asked, "You said you'd tell me about Michael Hayes." Walter nodded. "I will, after the race." He turned to Lewis. "You need to focus now. Don't let my old ghosts distract you." They walked together to the garage where the team was busy with race preparations. Walter found a quiet corner to watch, from occasionally speaking with engineers, but mostly keeping to himself. As the morning progressed, more people recognized Walter. An old team owner stopped by specifically to see him, embracing him like a long-lost brother. A racing journalist in his 70s nearly dropped his camera when he spotted Walter. "I was there that day," the journalist told Lewis quietly, "when the accident happened. Worst thing I ever saw on a track. No wonder he disappeared afterward." Lewis introduced Walter to several current drivers who had heard about the mystery mechanic helping Mercedes. Most were polite but distracted with their own race preparations. However, one veteran driver in his 40s approached with genuine interest. "My father has all your races on VHS," the driver told Walter. "He showed them to me when I was learning to drive. Said you had the smoothest style of your era." Walter seemed touched. "That's very kind. What was your father's name?" "Marco Rinaldi. He was a mechanic for Ferrari in the late 70s. Walter's face lit up. "I remember Marco. Brilliant. With engines. Is he still working in the sport?" "Retired now, but still watches every race," the driver said. "He'll be thrilled to know I met you." These encounters seemed to help Walter relax. By the time Lewis had to prepare for his pre-race routine, the old driver looked more at peace. "Any last advice?" Lewis asked him. Walter thought for a moment. "Trust your instincts. The car is good, but racing is still about feeling, not just data." Lewis nodded. "I'll remember that." "And Lewis," Walter added, his voice serious, "whatever happens today, I want you to know how proud." He stopped, emotion crossing his face. "How impressive your driving is. You have a natural talent few possess." Lewis felt there was more to those words than simple praise, but he didn't have time to question further. He had a race to win. As Lewis went through his final preparations, he glanced occasionally at Walter. The old driver sat quietly, watching everything with experienced eyes. There was something profoundly moving about having him there, a living connection to racing's dangerous past. The race itself was a blur of concentration for Lewis. Starting from pole, he got a perfect launch and led into the first corner. The car felt balanced and powerful, just as Walter had predicted it would after their adjustments. For 67 laps, Lewis pushed himself and the car to their limits. He built a lead, managed it through pit stops, and resisted pressure when a safety car bunched up the field. Through it all, he found himself thinking of Walter watching from the garage, the man who had raced on this same ground in a far more dangerous era. When Lewis took the checkered flag, his margin of victory was over 10 seconds. It was his most dominant performance of the season. The team erupted in celebration as he returned to the garage. Amid the congratulations, Lewis looked for Walter. He found the old driver standing back from the crowd, watching with a smile that held both joy and sadness. "You did it," Walter said simply when Lewis approached him. "We did it," Lewis replied. "Your adjustments made the difference." Walter shook his head. "You would have won anyway. You're a natural champion." The podium ceremony was a whirlwind of champagne and trophies. Throughout it all, Lewis kept glancing toward the garage area, making sure Walter was still there. The old driver had refused to come to the podium area, preferring to watch from a distance. After the official ceremonies and press conference, the Mercedes team gathered for their private celebration. Lewis made sure Walter was included, though. The elderly man clearly preferred to stay on the periphery of the gathering. Toto gave a speech thanking everyone, with special mention of our guest consultant, Walter Morris. When the team applauded him, Walter looked embarrassed, but grateful. As the celebration continued, one of the oldest team members approached Walter with his phone. He showed Walter something on the screen, and Walter's face changed. He looked at Lewis across the room, his expression unreadable. The team member brought Walter over to Lewis, still holding his phone. "Lewis, you need to see this," he said. "I realized who Mr. Morris was and found this old article." He turned his phone toward Lewis. On the screen was a scanned page from a 1966 racing magazine. The headline read, "British F2 champion Walter Morris eyes F1 move." Below was a black and white photo of a young Walter on a podium at Silverstone, holding a trophy aloft with an expression of pure joy. Lewis stared at the image, then at Walter. The man in the photo and the elderly mechanic beside him were separated by decades of life, yet the eyes were unmistakably the same. "I should have told you sooner," Walter said quietly. The team member scrolled to another article, and this is from 1968, after the accident. This article's headline was somber. "Morris survives Hockenheim crash. Hayes killed." There was a photo of a destroyed race car, and smaller pictures of Walter and Michael Hayes. Lewis looked at the photo of Hayes for the first time. The young driver had a familiar smile that Lewis had seen in old family photos. The connection that had seemed abstract suddenly became real. "He was my mother's cousin," Lewis said. "Michael Hayes was family." Walter nodded slowly. "I suspected as much when I learned your full name, but I wasn't certain until I came here." The team members around them looked confused by this exchange. Lewis asked for some privacy, and they moved to a quieter corner of the room. "Did you know who I was when I came to your garage that day?" Lewis asked directly. Walter sighed deeply. "Not at first. I just saw a young man with a broken-down car. But when you mentioned being a racer, I became curious. When I learned your name was Lewis Hamilton, I remembered that Hayes had relatives named Hamilton. His sister had married a man with that name. So you helped me because of who I am? Because of Michael?" Walter shook his head. "I helped you because your car was broken and you needed help. Learning who you might be came later." Lewis studied Walter's face, seeing no deception there, just the weight of a 57-year-old tragedy. "Tell me what happened," Lewis said. "The real story of the accident." Walter glanced around the celebration, where champagne was still flowing and music playing. "Not here. This isn't the place for such stories." "Then where?" Walter looked out toward the track, now quiet as evening approached. "Where it happened. I'll show you." They slipped away from the celebration, Walter leading Lewis toward a part of the modern circuit that overlapped with the old track. The setting sun cast long shadows as they walked in silence. Lewis realized that Walter was finally ready to face his past and to share it with the family of the man who had died that day so long ago. The modern Hockenheim circuit was quieter now, with most fans and teams heading home after the race. Walter walked slowly, his steps deliberate, as he led Lewis toward the back part of the track. "The old circuit went much deeper into the forest," Walter explained, pointing toward the trees. "There were 2 long straights connected by a hairpin turn far out in the woods. They called it the forest section. That's where it happened." They stopped at a spot where the modern track curved gently. Walter looked out beyond the barriers. "It was just there," he said quietly. "The trees have grown taller, but the place is the same." Lewis stood beside him, waiting patiently. The setting sun cast golden light through the trees, beautiful and peaceful. Very different from the violence that had occurred here decades ago. Walter took a deep breath. It was qualifying. The track was damp from rain earlier in the day. I was on a fast lap when my car developed a fuel leak. I didn't realize it immediately. By the time I saw smoke, oil was already on the track behind me. He paused, his eyes focused on the distant trees. "My car caught fire entering the forest straight. I tried to control it, but at those speeds..." He shook his head. "I hit the barriers and spun back onto the track. The marshals didn't have time to warn the next driver." "Michael," Lewis said softly. Walter nodded. "Michael Hayes. Young, talented, his first season in Formula One. He came around the corner at full speed, saw my burning car too late, and had nowhere to go." Walter's voice broke slightly. "He hit my car at nearly 150 miles per hour. Lewis could almost see it. The chaos, flames, and destruction of 2 race cars on this peaceful stretch of forest. You survived." "He didn't," Lewis said. "I had injuries. Broken legs, burns, punctured lung. But yes, I survived." Michael died instantly from head injuries. Walter's weathered hand gripped the track barrier. "I was unconscious when they pulled me out. I woke up in the hospital 2 days later. That's when they told me about Michael." Lewis felt a heaviness in his chest, thinking about the young man who had been his mother's cousin, a family member he'd never had the chance to know. "It wasn't your fault," Lewis said. "Racing accidents happen." Walter shook his head. "My car caused the oil slick that started the fire. If I'd noticed the leak earlier, you couldn't have known." "Perhaps not. But I was the experienced driver. He was the rookie." Walter's eyes glistened with tears in the fading light. "After I recovered physically, I couldn't bring myself to race again. Every time I thought about getting in a car, I saw Michael's face. So I walked away, turned down interviews, avoided racing friends. Eventually, people stopped asking. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of history heavy between them. My grandmother used to mention Michael sometimes," Lewis said. "She kept a photo of him in her living room. I didn't understand the significance when I was young." Walter nodded. "He was a special talent. Reminded me of Jochen Rindt. Fearless, but precise. Could have been a champion." "Like you could have been," Lewis said. Walter smiled sadly. Perhaps. We'll never know. He looked at Lewis. But the Hayes family has a champion now. Through you. Lewis felt an unexpected connection to the past. To Michael, to Walter, to the dangerous early days of Formula One that had paved the way for his own career. Is that why you agreed to help me? Because of Michael? Walter considered this. Not consciously, no, but when I realized who you might be, he paused. It felt like life had come full circle, like helping you might somehow balance what happened. They began walking slowly back toward the paddock, the shadows lengthening around them. Did you ever speak to Michael's family afterward? Lewis asked. I tried. I went to the funeral, but his parents were devastated. They didn't blame me, at least they said they didn't, but seeing me was painful for them. A reminder. Walter looked down at his hands. I wrote letters for a while, but eventually stopped. It seemed kinder to let them heal without reminders of that day. Lewis thought about his grandmother, who had lost a cousin but rarely spoke of it. How grief could echo through generations, even when the story faded. Thank you for telling me, Lewis said. For trusting me with this. Walter nodded. It's your family history, too. You deserve to know. As they approached the paddock, they could see the Mercedes team looking for them. The celebration was winding down, and Lewis would soon need to leave for media commitments. Will you come back? To races now? Lewis asked. Now that people know you're still around? Walter shook his head. No, this was enough. One last visit to say goodbye properly. He looked around at the modern circuit. Racing belongs to your generation now. Mine is just history. History worth remembering, Lewis said firmly. Pete approached them, looking relieved to have found Lewis. There you are. We need you for the final press conference in 10 minutes. Lewis nodded to Pete, then turned back to Walter. Will you at least stay for the team dinner tonight? If you'd like me to, Walter said. I insist, Lewis replied. As they walked back to the garage area, several photographers took pictures of them together. Lewis knew these images would soon be in racing publications alongside stories of the legendary Walter Morris returning to Hockenheim after 57 years. In the garage, Toto approached with a team jacket. For you, Mr. Morris, an official team member, even if just for one weekend. Walter accepted the jacket with surprise. That's very kind. Your contribution made a difference today, Toto said. Lewis's fastest lap was directly improved by your suggestions for the stadium section. Walter tried on the jacket, looking somewhat out of place in the modern team gear, but oddly right at the same time. He was a living bridge between racing's past and present. As Lewis left for the press conference, he saw Walter speaking with some of the younger engineers, who were listening intently to his stories from the 1960s. The old driver's face was animated. Now, the burden of his secret finally lifted. Lewis felt a new sense of connection, not just to Walter, but to the entire history of the sport he loved. And somewhere in that history was Michael Hayes, the cousin he'd never met, but whose story was now part of his own. After the press conference, Lewis found Walter sitting alone in the team hospitality area, a cup of tea in his hands. Most of the team had moved on to packing equipment for the next race. Mind if I join you? Lewis asked. Walter smiled. Please do. Lewis sat across from him. Now that Walter had shared the story of the accident, there was a different quality to his presence. More open, less burdened. I called my mother, Lewis said. Told her I met you. How did she react? She was surprised. Said she'd heard your name growing up, but didn't know much about you. Lewis paused. She wants to talk to you, if you're willing. Walter looked down at his tea. That would be difficult but good. After all these years. A comfortable silence fell between them. Lewis felt no need to rush the conversation. Walter had waited 57 years to return to Hockenheim. He deserved time to process everything. Finally, Walter spoke again. "There's more to tell you about my life after racing, if you want to hear it." "I'd like that very much," Lewis said. Walter settled back in his chair. "After the accident, I spent 3 months in the hospital. When I got out, I couldn't face racing again. Reporters followed me everywhere, wanting interviews about the crash and about Michael. I just wanted peace." "So you disappeared," Lewis said. Walter nodded. "I went back to my hometown, the same village where you found me. My father had left me his workshop. I turned it into a garage and started fixing regular cars." He smiled faintly. "A far cry from Formula One, but honest work." "Were you alone?" "Not at first. I had a fiancée, Margaret. We'd been planning to marry after the 1968 season." Walter's eyes softened at the memory. "She stood by me through everything. The injuries, the nightmares, the depression. We married in 1969. Her strength saved me." Lewis tried to picture a young Walter and Margaret, building a quiet life together while the racing world moved on without them. "We never had children," Walter continued. "The doctor said my injuries made that unlikely. But we had a good life, together. Margaret taught at the local school. I ran the garage. We traveled when we could, though never to races. Did you follow Formula One from a distance?" "Always. I couldn't leave it completely behind." Walter chuckled. Margaret would say, "I was like an old sailor watching the sea from shore. I kept track of the drivers, the cars, the technology, watched every race on television." Lewis thought about Walter in his small garage, following the sport he'd left behind, applying his racing knowledge to fixing everyday cars. "When did you realize who I was? Beyond being Lewis Hamilton, the F1 driver, I mean." Walter thought for a moment. "When you told me your name that first day, it sounded familiar, but I couldn't place why. Then you mentioned growing up in Stevenage. I remembered that Michael's sister had married a man named Hamilton, and they'd settled in Stevenage." Walter sipped his tea. "I started wondering if you might be related. The coincidence seemed too great. Your car breaking down right outside my garage. When I looked you up and saw your family photos in racing articles, I noticed you had the same smile as Michael. Why didn't you say anything?" "What would I have said?" "Excuse me, are you related to the man who died because of my car malfunction 50 years ago?" Walter shook his head. "I wasn't certain, and it didn't seem right to bring up such pain based on a hunch." Lewis understood. Some connections were too delicate, too burdened with history to approach directly. "But then you invited me here, to Hockenheim of all places," Walter continued. "It felt like more than coincidence, like something was pulling us together to close an old circle." "Do you believe in fate?" Lewis asked. Walter considered this. "I believe in patterns, in things coming full circle if you live long enough." He looked at Lewis. "When I was your age, I was angry at the universe for what happened to Michael, for my career ending. Now I see how life weaves together in ways we can't predict. Like me finding your garage on a rainy day?" "Exactly." Walter's eyes crinkled with a smile. "Though your car's cooling system really did have a problem, that wasn't fate, just poor maintenance." They both laughed, breaking the serious mood. "What will you do now?" Lewis asked. "Go back to the garage?" "Yes. It's my home, my life." Walter looked around the bustling, racing environment. This world isn't mine anymore. I've made my peace with it, but I don't belong here. I disagree, Lewis said. The knowledge you shared this weekend made a real difference. The team thinks you're a genius. Walter waved this away. Just an old mechanic with a good memory. Would you consider consulting for us? Not traveling to races, but looking at data, offering suggestions from your garage. Walter seemed surprised by the offer. You're serious? Completely. You spotted issues our computers missed. That's invaluable. Walter thought about it. Perhaps, on one condition. Name it. You stop by my garage when you're in England. Not for work, just to talk. About racing, life, whatever comes to mind. Walter smiled. It gets lonely fixing farm tractors. Deal, Lewis said without hesitation. The team dinner that evening was relaxed and joyful. Walter sat beside Lewis, quietly enjoying the celebration but declining offers to make a speech. Several team members asked him technical questions, which he answered with clarity and modesty. As the evening wound down, Lewis saw Walter in conversation with Toto. The team principal was listening intently, nodding occasionally. When Walter finished speaking, Toto shook his hand with what looked like deep respect. What was that about? Lewis asked Walter later. I was telling him about Michael, Walter said. About the kind of driver he was, how much potential he had. Walter paused, and about how safety measures might have saved him, the kind of precautions you all take for granted now. Lewis thought about how much safer modern Formula One was compared to Walter's era. The protection that current drivers had was built on the painful lessons from the past. Each generation makes it better for the next, Lewis said. Walter nodded. That's the hope. As they left the dinner, Lewis walked Walter to his hotel room. The old driver seemed tired but at peace. Thank you for bringing me here, Walter said at his door, for helping me face this place again. Thank you for sharing your story, Lewis replied. And Michael's story. Walter smiled. Get some rest. You're a world champion with more races to win. As Lewis headed to his own room, he felt the weight of history and connection. His victory today seemed deeper now, part of a longer story that included Walter Morris and Michael Hayes. A story of loss, redemption, and the unexpected ways lives could intersect across time. The morning after the race, Lewis and Walter had breakfast together before their flights home. Walter seemed lighter, as if sharing his story had eased a burden he'd carried for decades. I've been thinking about your offer, Walter said, spreading jam on his toast, to consult for the team. And? Lewis asked hopefully. I'll do it. Not for the money, but because it feels right. Walter smiled. Turns out you can't spend 50 years with engines without having something to contribute. The team will be thrilled, Lewis said. Pete's already talking about sending you data packages. They finished breakfast and said goodbye at the airport. Walter would take a commercial flight back to London while Lewis had media commitments in Germany before returning to England. Thank you again, Walter said as they parted, for bringing me back to racing, even briefly. This isn't goodbye, Lewis reminded him. I'll see you at your garage soon. Walter nodded, his eyes bright. I'll hold you to that. 2 weeks later, after the Hungarian Grand Prix, Lewis drove to Walter's village. He found the old mechanic working on a vintage Austin Healey, his hands as steady and skilled as ever. She's a beauty, Lewis said, admiring the classic car. Walter looked up, his face breaking into a smile. Belongs to the local doctor. He only drives it in summer. He wiped his hands on a rag. How was Hungary? Second place, Lewis said. Would have been better if we'd had you there. They went inside for tea. Lewis noticed that Walter had added something new to his wall of racing memorabilia. A photo of himself with Lewis at Hockenheim, both wearing Mercedes team gear. "My first new racing photo in 57 years, Walter said, following Lewis's gaze. Lewis took a seat at the small table. "I spoke with my mother about you, and about Michael." Walter's expression grew serious. "How did that go?" "Good. Emotional." Lewis stirred his tea. "She'd like to meet you, if that's something you'd consider." Walter was quiet for a moment. "I'd like that. It's long overdue." "There's something else," Lewis said. "I found some old home videos at my grandmother's house. There's footage of Michael from Christmas 1967, a few months before the accident. Would you want to see it?" Walter's hand trembled slightly as he set down his cup. "Yes, very much." Lewis took out his phone and pulled up the video he'd digitized. The grainy footage showed a family Christmas gathering. A young man in his 20s was opening gifts, laughing with family members. Michael Hayes had the same smile Lewis had seen in racing photos. But here he was, relaxed, surrounded by loved ones. Walter watched in silence, his weathered face soft with emotion. When the short clip ended, he didn't speak for several minutes. "He looks happy," Walter finally said. "That's how I want to remember him, not from that day at Hockenheim." "My grandmother kept his memory alive," Lewis said. "She told me he was brave and talented, that he followed his dreams." "She was right," Walter nodded. "He had such natural ability, the kind that can't be taught." They talked for hours that afternoon. Walter showed Lewis his collection of racing books and magazines, preserved carefully over the decades. He shared stories about racing against legends like Jim Clark and Graham Hill, not as famous rivals, but as a midfield driver who occasionally surprised the stars. "I never won a championship," Walter said, "but I had moments I'm proud of. Days when everything clicked and I drove beyond my usual abilities, like my day at Hockenheim," Lewis said, "when everything just worked." "Exactly." Walter smiled. "Those perfect days are rare. You have to treasure them." As evening approached, Lewis helped Walter close up the garage. Before leaving, he had one more question. "At Hockenheim, right before the race, you started to say something. You said, 'I want you to know how proud,' and then you stopped." Lewis looked at Walter. "What were you going to say?" Walter leaned against his workbench. "I was going to say how proud Michael would have been to see his family name continuing in racing, to see you achieving what he never had the chance to." "You think he would have been proud?" Lewis asked. "Without question," Walter said firmly. "When a driver with true racing spirit sees talent in another, there's no room for jealousy, only appreciation. Michael had that spirit." Lewis thought about the cousin he'd never met, the young man in the Christmas video with his whole life ahead of him. "I wish I'd known him." "In some ways, you do," Walter said. "The same racing blood runs in your veins, the same instinct for finding the perfect line through a corner." As Lewis prepared to leave, Walter went to a cabinet and took out a small box. "I want you to have this," he said, opening it. Inside was a racing patch, the kind drivers wore on their overalls in the 1960s. It showed the British racing colors and the number 21. "This was Michael's," Walter explained. "After the funeral, his mother gave it to me. Said he would have wanted me to have something of his, but it belongs with his family now. With you." Lewis carefully took the patch, feeling the weight of history in the small piece of fabric. "I'll treasure it. Put it in your racing room with your trophies," Walter suggested. "A reminder of where you come from." Lewis nodded, too moved to speak. This small patch connected him to a family history he hadn't fully known, to the cousin who had raced and died before Lewis was born. "One more thing," Walter said. "When I fixed your car that rainy day, I knew there was something special about you. Not just your driving talent, but something in your character. Now I understand what it was." "What?" Walter smiled. "You have the same look in your eyes that Michael had. Determination mixed with joy. The mark of someone who truly loves racing." As Lewis drove away from Morris Motors, he glanced in his rearview mirror. Walter stood in front of his garage, a solitary figure against the old building. Not a forgotten relic of racing's past, but a living connection to its history. And now, an unexpected part of Lewis's future. The racing patch sat carefully on, the passenger seat beside him, a bridge between generations of his family. Lewis felt a new sense of purpose in his racing career, not just to win for himself, but to carry forward the legacy that included Michael Hayes, whose own journey had been cut tragically short on a rainy day at Hockenheim so many years ago. 3 months later, Lewis stood in the Silverstone paddock with Walter beside him. It had taken some convincing, but Walter had agreed to attend the British Grand Prix as Lewis's special guest. "How does it feel to be back at Silverstone?" Lewis asked. Walter gazed around at the historic circuit. "Strange, but good. I won my Formula 2 championship here. Feels like yesterday and a lifetime ago at the same time." This time, Walter wasn't trying to stay hidden. He wore a Mercedes team shirt and a pass that identified him as a team consultant. In the months since Germany, Walter had been working remotely with the engineers, his old-school knowledge blending with their modern technology. As they walked through the paddock, heads turned. Word had spread about Walter Morris, the lost legend of British motorsport, who had returned to help Lewis Hamilton. Several older team members came to shake Walter's hand, and young drivers asked for introductions. "You're becoming a celebrity again," Lewis teased. Walter chuckled. "At my age, it's nice to be remembered at all." They stopped at a small ceremony area that had been set up in the paddock. The British Racing Drivers Club had arranged a special event to honor Walter's contributions to British motorsport. Several racing legends were present, including Sir Jackie Stewart and other drivers from Walter's era. "I don't deserve all this fuss," Walter whispered to Lewis. "Yes, you do," Lewis replied firmly. The ceremony was brief but moving. Walter was presented with an honorary membership to the BRDC and a plaque recognizing his racing achievements and his 5 decades of mechanical expertise. When asked to speak, Walter was characteristically modest. "Racing gave me the best years of my youth," he said simply. "And now, in my old age, it's given me new purpose. Thank you for remembering an old driver who never forgot his love for this sport." After the ceremony, Lewis introduced Walter to his family. Lewis's mother, especially, had been eager to meet him. When they shook hands, there was a moment of shared understanding between them, a connection through Michael that needed no words. "Thank you for helping my son," she said, "and for remembering Michael all these years." Walter nodded, emotion in his eyes. "Your cousin was special. I see the same spirit in Lewis." Later, as they watched young drivers in a support race, Walter pointed to a teenager in a blue car who was taking particularly smooth lines through the corners. "That one has something special," Walter observed. "Reminds me of both Michael and you." The same natural feeling for the car. Lewis watched the young driver. "His name's Jamie Allen. He's only 16 but already turning heads." "Racing always renews itself," Walter said. "New talent coming through, building on what came before." The next day, Lewis won the British Grand Prix with Walter watching from the Mercedes garage. In his victory speech, Lewis thanked Walter publicly, calling him a living connection to our racing heritage and a brilliant mind who's helped us improve our car. Cameras showed Walter in the garage, looking embarrassed but pleased by the recognition. After the podium celebrations, Lewis took Walter to a quiet corner of the team hospitality area. "I have something to tell you," Lewis said. "I'm establishing a scholarship program for young drivers who don't have financial backing. It'll cover their racing costs from karting through the junior formulas." "That's wonderful," Walter said. "Racing is too expensive for most talented kids these days. I'm calling it the Hayes Morris Racing Foundation," Lewis continued, "to honor both Michael's memory and your contribution to the sport." Walter stared at Lewis, visibly moved. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll help run it," Lewis suggested. "Your eye for talent and your knowledge would be invaluable. You could mentor these young drivers, share your wisdom." Walter thought for a moment. "I'd be honored. Though I'll need to keep my garage running too. Those village tractors won't fix themselves." "We'll make it work," Lewis promised. "Maybe bring some of the young drivers to your garage occasionally. Let them see that racing knowledge can come from unexpected places." In the weeks that followed, Walter began dividing his time between his garage and his new role with Lewis's foundation. He seemed energized by the purpose of helping young racers, especially those from backgrounds without racing connections or money. One rainy Tuesday, Lewis visited the garage again. This time, he wasn't alone. He brought Jamie Allen, the young driver Walter had pointed out at Silverstone. "Jamie's the first recipient of the Hayes Morris Scholarship," Lewis explained. "I thought you two should meet properly." Walter showed Jamie around the humble garage, telling stories about racing in the 1960s and explaining how the mechanical principles of those old cars still applied to modern racing. The teenager listened with rapt attention, asking thoughtful questions that impressed both Lewis and Walter. "He reminds me of how I was at his age," Lewis said quietly to Walter as they watched Jamie examine an old racing engine Walter had kept from his racing days. "With better guidance than we had," Walter added. "That's the point, isn't it? To pass on what we've learned." As the day ended, Walter stood in front of Morris Motors with Lewis and Jamie. 3 generations of racing, connected by shared passion and now by Michael's memory too. "I never thought my garage would see another racing driver, let alone 2 at once," Walter said with a smile. "Get used to it," Lewis replied. "This is just the beginning." Walter looked at the old building behind him, then at the 2 drivers before him, one at the peak of his career, one just beginning. Morris Motors might need a bigger sign. They laughed together as the evening sun broke through the clouds, casting golden light on the small garage that had brought them together by chance. Or perhaps by something more than chance. Later, as Lewis drove Jamie back to London, the young driver asked, "What did Walter whisper to you when we were leaving?" Lewis smiled, remembering Walter's words. "I didn't just fix your car that day, Lewis. I put a piece of Michael in it, the same fighting spirit he had. Now you're carrying both our legacies every time you race." He told me that racing isn't just about being the fastest, Lewis replied. "It's about carrying forward the spirit of those who raced before us, about honoring their memory by doing what they loved, as well as we possibly can." Jamie nodded thoughtfully as they drove into the sunset, the next chapter of racing's eternal story already beginning to unfold. Thank you for joining us for this emotional journey through racing history, family connections, and unexpected second chances. Where are you listening from? We'd love to know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story about Lewis Hamilton and Walter Morris, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming tales. Don't forget to share this video with friends and family who appreciate stories about racing, redemption, and the bridges between generations. Each share helps spread kindness and awareness about the human stories behind the sports we love. Until next time, keep your engines running and your hearts open to the unexpected connections that might just be waiting around the next corner.